Well, many inner city buildings are in an advanced state of disrepair. They're often without water and electricity, dark, forbidding and dangerous. But they are the places thousands of people, including immigrants, find refuge. Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon has documented the struggles they experience and joins us on the program tonight to share what he's observed and written about in his book, The Blinded City, 10 Years in Inner City Johannesburg. Matthew, good evening, and thank you for joining us. Buildings have stories, don't they? Grouping them under one label belies the complexity of how the people that live in them survive. So what are some of the stories you heard from the people themselves and how they came to be there and why?
Well, these buildings have very complex histories connected to post-apartheid history of the shortage of housing in inner cities and a core issue around the crisis of unlawful occupations or so-called hijack buildings is the chronic shortage of housing in inner city Johannesburg. Those connect with, of course, regional histories of migration, things like social and political turmoil in Zimbabwe, but also people coming from all over South Africa into Johannesburg looking for a better life. And the key thing to understand is, yes, of course, there are criminal syndicates who take advantage, but the majority of residents in these buildings are low-income households who are looking for a better life and simply cannot afford decent housing in the inner city.
So undocumented immigrants are placed right at the top as blameworthy, with calls from politicians for their arrest and mass deportation, with words like only then will you see a cleaner Johannesburg, the buildings being available and getting them into healthy standards, and the city generating revenue. At the moment, the city is losing water and electricity to those criminals. Just some of the sentiments we've heard in the aftermath of that tragedy in Marshalltown in the Johannesburg CBD. How do you respond to that picture? And how do you get South Africans who also hold that view to see it differently? And why should they?
Well, I think the first thing is that many people in these buildings are South Africans. One can't, this idea that these unlawful occupations are just occupied by undocumented migrants is just not correct. Many are South Africans, but there are also many documented migrants with asylum cases. But the key issue is that time and time again, for instance, Operation Fiela in 2015, raided buildings have been under Mashaba. There were continual raids, and none of these militarized approaches towards this issue have worked. Large-scale police raids have not worked to improve conditions. I'm not saying one shouldn't investigate those who are profiteering off it, but one cannot deal with the housing crisis, these poor conditions, unless you have a meaningful engagement with communities living under these conditions. You'll never deal with it simply through deportation. As long as there's political turmoil in Zimbabwe, drought and so on, people will come back to the city. And so we have to acknowledge Johannesburg is and always has been a city of migrants. And until politicians are really prepared to engage with civil society, the occupants of these spaces, to improve conditions, we really risk something like this happening again. Because attempting to deal with this through deportation, migration rates has not worked. It's been a failure. And we've seen that with what happened with 80 Albert Street.
The problem, though, Matthew, as you're saying, there needs to be more stakeholder engagement. I know we overuse the word stakeholders, but the reality is that everyone who's impacted by, a consequence or a context has to be included in a discussion around how to, in inverted commas, fix the problem. And some of that work has been done, and we had interviews earlier on about this inner city housing plan, but the disconnect has been the lack of political will, the lack of funding, and people not just staying the course in making sometimes really good plans come to fruition. What would you say then, given that we have plans and there have been so-called consultations with the city and others, as you listen to all of this unfold and what's being said, what do you think, where do you think the blind spot is? What's missing from this debate and discussion?
Look, we've had good plans. For instance, what's called the ICHIP plan, developed in 2014, 2015 to expand low-cost housing and temporary emergency accommodation in the inner city. That was adopted in 2017 by Mashaba's mayoral council, but it's been radically underfunded. So while we have they haven't been adequately funded to expand affordable accommodation and temporary emergency accommodation for those who might need to be evicted for on health grounds, because the Constitution doesn't say you can't evict, it says you can't evict if it leads to homelessness, and that's key to understanding. We've had many NGOs blamed, but the key issue is, and there's simply not enough accommodation at the moment to deal with those people who might need to be evicted, and there has to be a solution that improves the living conditions of those already in the buildings. So while we're developing longer-term plans, while the Commission of Inquiry is going on, there needs to be an improvement in living conditions, and that requires working with civil society, the groups like Inner City Federation, who represent South Africans and international migrants, who represent over 70 buildings in the inner city. So the framework is there, but they've been struggling for years now to get the to take them seriously and to meaningfully engage, also to get rid of these criminal syndicates. Of course, it can't just rely on the cities. National government has to step in with a meaningful urban housing policy that looks towards upgrading buildings, developing, improving conditions. But right now, we need improved conditions of fire safety, access to water, and so on, to prevent another tragedy like this taking place.
Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon, thank you very much for talking to us tonight. We appreciate it. He is the author of The Blinded City, 10 Years in Inner City Johannesburg.